Montana Territory, April 1879, the stagecoach lurched sideways as the front wheel caught a rut, and in the next instant, the door flung open and tossed her straight into the dirt. Perrie James barely had time to scream before a rough hand closed around hers, strong and sure, yanking her out of the air just before she hit the ground. "I've got you," the man said, his voice low and steady. She blinked through the dust, heart pounding, and found herself staring up at a man with wind-creased skin, a square jaw, and eyes the color of storm clouds over the plains. His hat had fallen back on its strap, revealing hair the color of wheat left too long in the sun. "I said I've got you," he repeated, holding her close, steadying her feet. Perrie clutched his coat without meaning to. "Thank you," she breathed, still shaken. The coach driver jumped down, cursing. Damn axles cracked clean through ain't going nowhere. People began unloading bags and arguing. Perrie looked around, nothing but empty land and a few pine-covered hills, no town in sight. "Well," the man said, adjusting his hat and turning toward her again, "you just about flew straight into that ditch. Lucky I was standing there." "Lucky," she echoed, brushing dust from her skirt. "I suppose I should thank you properly. I'm Perrie James." He tipped his head. "Nathaniel Hartley. Most folks call me Nate," she nodded, tucking a black lock of hair behind her ear. "Well, thank you, Mr. Hartley. I owe you," he smiled, kind but quiet. "No debt owed. Though if you're waitin' to get to town, you're out of luck. Closest place is Dry Creek, that's 10 miles east. Stage won't be movin' today." Perrie's shoulders slumped. She clutched her carpet bag tighter. "I was heading there. I've got a teaching job waiting. You walkin'?" "No." He looked at her shoes. "Good, you wouldn't make it." She frowned. "And you, Mr. Hartley, what brings you out here?" "My ranch is just past those hills. Came in for supplies. Was headin' back when I saw the coach slowin'." He studied her for a moment. "You got anyone meetin' you in town?" "No," she said softly. "No one." He nodded once, then looked away, thoughtful. "Well, I've got a horse and wagon. You're welcome to ride with me. I can take you to Dry Creek tomorrow once you've rested." She hesitated. He caught her eye. "I give you my word, Miss James, I'm not the kind of man who'd take advantage of a woman. You'll have your own room, plenty of space." She searched his face. There was something steadier than kindness in his gaze, something like quiet honor. She nodded. "All right." They rode in silence for the first few minutes, the wagon creaking beneath them. The land rolled out wide and golden, dotted with pine and sage. Snow still clung to the shadows in the hills. "You from back east?" he asked after a while. "Missouri," she said. "My parents passed last fall. I came out here for a new start." He nodded. "You'll find it's a hard land, but fair most days." She looked at him. "And you, always lived here, born in Arkansas, came out when I was 16. Been running the ranch ever since." "Alone," he glanced her way. "Had a brother once. He died in the war. My mother followed soon after. It's just me now." She studied his profile. There was a sadness there, deep set but quiet, like hers. They reached the ranch near dusk. The house was simple, 2 stories with a wide porch and cedar shutters. A barn stood off to the side, and chickens scattered as they pulled up. "I'll bring your bag inside. You can use the front room upstairs," he said, hopping down. Perrie followed him in. The house smelled of pine soap and coffee. It was clean but not polished. Lived in, not lonely. That night he cooked beans and cornbread. She offered to help, but he waved her off gently. They ate by lamplight. She watched the way he moved, efficient, quiet, thoughtful. "I'm sorry about your brother," she said after a while. He looked up slowly, then nodded. "Thank you. Mine died too," she added. "Typhoid. He was 12. There was a pause. Then he said, "I'm sorry." Their eyes met. Something passed between them, shared grief maybe. Or just the comfort of being seen. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and eggs. He had already saddled the horses. "You sure you want to go?" he asked, handing her a biscuit. She blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you could stay, not forever," he added quickly. "Just a few days, rest. Let the town know you're delayed." She hesitated, then nodded. "All right, a few days." They spent the afternoon tending chores. She fed the chickens while he fixed a fence. At supper, they sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills. "I thought the West would feel lonelier," she said. He looked at her. "It does until it doesn't." She smiled faintly. The next evening, a storm blew in sudden and harsh. Lightning cracked the sky and the wind howled against the windows. She stood near the fireplace as he lit another lamp. "Thank you for letting me stay," she said softly. "I mean it." He turned to her. "You saved me from something too," she frowned. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer. "I've spent years keeping quiet, not needing anyone. Then you come flying out of that coach like fire from the sky, and suddenly I can't stop thinking about what life might look like if someone else was in it." Her breath caught. He reached for her hand. "Perrie, I know it's fast, but I'm not the kind of man to speak if I don't mean it. I've got this land, a house, a quiet life. It's yours if you want it." She stared at him, heart pounding. "And not just the ranch," he added, voice rougher now. "You can have my heart too." The wind howled outside, but inside everything was still. She stepped closer and placed her hand over his. "I think I already do," she whispered. His breath caught, and then he pulled her into his arms, holding her like he meant it, and she knew somehow that she had landed in the only place she was ever meant to be. The next morning brought a hush so complete, Perrie could hear the soft thud of hooves in the paddock beyond the window. Pale light filtered through the muslin curtains, catching on the worn wooden floorboards and the faint outline of a rocking chair in the corner. Her boots sat neatly beside the bed, dusted from yesterday's work, and the scent of cedar hung faint and clean in the air. Downstairs, she found Nate bent over a ledger at the kitchen table, his wrist smudged with graphite, the edge of his shirt cuff rolled back to the elbow. "You keep records," she said, stepping into the room. He didn't look up right away. "You can't run stock without knowing what you've got and what you've lost." She moved closer, noting the neat columns of script. "How many head? 65, 10 are pregnant, lost 2 calves over the winter. Snow came early, caught me off guard." She pulled a chair and sat across from him. "Do you ever think about expanding?" His pencil paused. "Thought about it, but I'd need more hands, and I don't bring on hired men unless I've known him a while." She nodded slowly. "I could help." He met her eyes then, and for the first time since she'd arrived, his expression wavered. Something flickered there, not doubt, but the gravity of her offer. "You ever wrangle cattle, Miss James?" "No," she said, folding her hands. "But I can read weather, mend tears, and I don't mind calluses. I learn quick, and I don't spook easy." He leaned back, studying her. "You mean to stay then?" "I mean to do more than pass through." Her voice was steady. "If you'll have me." He let out a breath, quiet and deliberate. Then he rose, walked to the stove, and poured her a cup of coffee. When he set it before her, he touched the rim with one finger. "All right, then." They spent the day side by side, repairing a broken length of fencing that bordered the east pasture. She held the posts upright while he hammered them down, dirt clinging to her palms, the wind curling hair loose from her braid. By mid-afternoon, a layer of sweat lined her back, and her shoulders ached in a way that felt honest. "You're not afraid of hard work," he said quietly, adjusting his grip on the post driver, "not when it leads to something solid." He glanced at her then, his jaw tight with thought. "You ever think about what solid looks like?" She wiped her brow with the back of her hand. "Sometimes. Mostly I just know what it doesn't look like. Empty rooms. People who don't stay." Nate nodded once and went back to hammering, the rhythm of it grounding. That evening, after the dinner dishes were stacked and the sky had turned to bruised lavender, they walked the edge of the pasture. The cattle had settled, low shapes hunched against the coming cold. A hawk wheeled overhead, silent and sharp. "You ever think you'd end up in Montana?" he asked her, watching the horizon. "No, but I never thought I'd lose everything at 26 either." "Life doesn't wait for you to be ready." He picked up a stone, turned it over in his hand, then let it fall. "I used to think I had to hold everything together by myself, that if I didn't, it'd all fall apart. And now," he stopped walking, "now I think maybe it was never meant to be done alone." Perrie looked at him, her breath catching not from cold but from the weight in his words. "I've been alone a long time too," she said, "but I don't want to be any more." He stepped closer, his hand brushing hers, tentative but deliberate. "I'm not a man who promises more than he can give, but what I have, I'll give all of." She didn't answer with words. Instead, she reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his, the way one stakes claim to something real. They stood like that until the last light dipped behind the hills, their joined hands resting between them, quiet and sure. By the third week, Perrie had learned the rhythm of the land, or at least the way it moved through Nate. He rose before the sky turned, pausing at the window just long enough to read the wind. She followed him more often now, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to know what he saw when he looked out over the ridgeline, quiet and still as a prayer. That morning, while Nate checked the lower creek for signs of erosion, Perrie stayed behind to mend the hem of his winter coat. She'd found it draped over the barn rail, torn along the sleeve seam. The stitching was old and uneven in places, the kind done when a man had no one else to do it for him. She worked by the window, the sunlight sharp over the table, her needle steady. The cabin was silent, but for the low groan of wind through the eaves and the occasional clink of enamelware in the drying rack. When she finished, she folded the coat over the back of a chair, fingers lingering on the worn canvas. The door opened behind her. "You didn't have to do that," Nate said, brushing dust from his collar. "I know." She turned, wiping her hands on her apron, "but I wanted you to have something that held." He looked at her for a long moment, then stepped aside to unlace his boots. "The creek's running higher than it should be. Might be spring runoff from the mountains." "Is that bad?" "Not yet. But if it keeps rising, we'll need to shore up the north fence. Water cuts fast through shallow roots." She leaned against the table. "I can help with that too." He gave a nod, unhurried. "You've already made more difference here than any hired man I've ever brought on." She tilted her head. "Is that meant to flatter me?" "It's meant to tell the truth." They shared a quiet look, the kind that didn't need explaining. Then he glanced toward the coat. "Did you sew that by hand?" "My mother was a seamstress before she married. She taught me to keep my stitches even when I was crying." "Why would you be crying?" "I didn't want to learn how to mend. I wanted to learn how to leave." He walked to the chair and picked up the coat, running his thumb along the fresh stitching. "And now I think mending might be its own kind of leaving, letting go of what's frayed. Making room for what still fits." He folded the coat carefully and set it on the table. "You have a way of seeing things that makes them feel less heavy. And you have a way of carrying things like they don't weigh anything at all." He stepped closer. "They do." "I just got used to the ache." She didn't answer right away. Then, "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Outside, a hawk screamed once, high and sharp. Nate reached for her hand, calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "I've been thinking," he said. "If you're set on staying, there's something I'd like to ask." Her breath stilled. "I don't want to keep calling you Miss James, and I don't want you sleeping in the guest room come next spring." She looked down, heart thudding, then back up. "You want me to marry you?" "I do," he said. "Not because I need a hand on the ranch, but because I want to wake up beside you every morning we're given." She blinked once, and then a soft smile spread across her face. "You're certain?" "I've never been more." She stepped forward and rested her palm against the center of his chest. "Then yes, I will." He kissed her then, quiet, reverent, as though he knew what it meant to have something returned after too many years of going without. That evening, she sat beside him on the porch as dusk settled low over the hills. He held her hand with the same steadiness as he had that first day, only now it was not to steady her fall, but to walk with her into the life they'd chosen. And in the hush between the wind and the dark, she knew. This place, this man, this quiet beginning, it was everything she'd never dared ask for, and all of it was hers. The first true thaw came in early May, when the cottonwoods along the creek began to show the whisper of green. Water spilled over the rocks in a steady murmur now, no longer wild from melt, just certain. Perrie stood ankle-deep in the kitchen garden, sleeves rolled past her elbows as she pressed her palms into the warming soil. Her hands were rougher than they'd been weeks ago, but it didn't bother her. "The earth gave back when you gave to it." Nate was at the west pasture, laying the foundation for the new lean-to. He'd shown her the plans in charcoal on butcher paper rolled out across the kitchen table the night before. He didn't draw with precision, but with purpose, lines guided by memory and need. Perrie pressed the last seed into the row and brushed her fingers clean against the hem of her apron. She turned when she heard hooves in the distance, slow and deliberate, a rider, not local. She straightened as the horse approached. A woman, older with gray threaded through her braid and a black shawl pinned over her shoulders, dismounted before the house. Her eyes were sharp as flint and missed nothing. "You Perrie James?" the woman asked, voice low and even. "I am. I'm Althea McKinnon. I run the boarding house in Dry Creek. You left word with the postmaster that you wouldn't be taking the schoolhouse job." Perrie set her hands on her waist. "Yes, I did. I wasn't expecting a reply. Didn't come to argue it," Althea said. "Just thought it right to know who's settling out this way. You staying with Hartley? I'm marrying him." Althea's mouth twitched, not in disapproval, but something close to approval held in check. "Well, you've got the look of a woman who's made up her mind." "I have," Althea nodded once. "Dry Creek's small, but not so small we don't remember. Nate's been alone a long time. I imagine it'll be good he has someone who sees him." Perrie tilted her head. "You've known him a while, since before the war. He used to bring his mother in when she needed tonic. Rode 12 miles in snow once just to fetch her birch bark. He don't talk much, but he holds on to what matters." Perrie stepped forward slightly, her voice softer. "Did he ever come into town after she passed?" "No. Not until last month, when he walked into the Mercantile and asked if the stage from Missouri had arrived." Perrie's throat tightened. Althea glanced toward the barn. "You'll have a quiet life out here. But not an empty one if you're careful with it." "I intend to be." The older woman mounted her horse again. "You need anything, you send word. Dry Creek watches its own, even the ones who live on the edges." She rode off without another word, and Perrie stood there a long moment before turning back to the garden. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp soil. She dug her fingers back into the earth and pressed the last line of seeds into place. That evening, Nate returned with dust on his collar and a shallow cut on his forearm from a slipped beam. "You should let me clean that," she said, drawing water and unwrapping the linen from the shelf. He sat at the table without protest. "It's nothing. You bleed like anyone else." He watched her work in silence, the cut not deep but wide enough to sting. She dabbed carbolic gently over it, then wrapped the cloth around his forearm with steady hands. He looked at her then, quiet but searching. "Someone came by. Althea McKinnon. She asked questions. She came to see who I was. I think she left satisfied." He nodded once. "She's not one for wasting words. I liked her." He shifted slightly, eyes still on hers. "I've been thinking about the wedding." She finished tying the cloth and stepped back. "What about it? I want it here, just us. Maybe the preacher from Linton Hill if he'll ride out. No guests, no spectacle." She reached for the basin. "That's what I hoped for." "You sure?" "I didn't come out west for show. I came for a life that fits." He stood slowly, then crossed the room and took her hands in his. "Then let's make it ours. No waiting." She looked at him, not surprised but moved. "Tomorrow, if the preacher can ride by sundown." She nodded. "I'll wear the blue dress, the one with the buttons that don't match." He smiled, faint and true. "That one's always been my favorite." The next morning, the preacher arrived with dust on his boots and a pocket Bible in his vest. They stood beneath the cottonwood by the garden, the branches just beginning to leaf out, and said their vows with the smell of river wind and warming soil around them. Nate held her hand like it was the first true thing he'd ever touched. When the words were finished and the preacher tipped his hat and rode off, they stayed there under the tree, fingers still laced. "I never thought I'd have this," she whispered. "You do now," he said, and kissed her once, slow and certain. And for the first time in years, Perrie felt not only chosen, but kept. June brought warmth that lingered into evening, not sharp like it had been in spring, but full, settling into the bones of the land with the weight of promise. The hills wore summer like a second skin, soft and green, and the cattle moved slow through the tall grass, heads low, tails flicking lazily in the sun. Perrie stood at the barn door, watching Nate drive the final nail into the new lean-to. His shirt clung to his back, dusty from the day's work, and his hat shaded his face just enough to hide the corners of his eyes. The structure would keep the calves dry come autumn, and he'd built it with her in mind, wide enough to stack bales without needing to lift them too high, with a sloped roof angled to drain melt clean into the catch barrel she'd insisted on using. She crossed the yard with a tin cup of water, cool from the creek barrel. "You missed supper," she said, offering it to him. He took it and drank deep, then handed it back. Didn't want to stop with the light holding. She ran her hand along the edge of the new wood. You always work through when something's halfway done, only when it matters. He turned then, brushing sawdust from his pants, and looked at her like she was something he'd been building toward and hadn't known it. Have you thought any more about the land east of the ridge? She asked, folding her arms loosely. I have, he said. Soil's richer than I figured, could put up a second garden, maybe fruit trees. You said you liked the idea of growing things that take time. I still do. Her voice was quiet but steady. Especially if we plant them together, he nodded, and for a moment neither of them spoke. A crow called from the pine edge and a breeze rolled in, carrying the scent of wild mint. Back inside the house, she laid the last of the clean linens into the cedar chest by the wall. Nate leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with a softness she hadn't seen in him during the first weeks. I wrote to the county clerk, he said, voice low. Had them send out the final deed papers. The land's under both our names now. She straightened, lids blinking, not from surprise but from the way that settled something in her chest. You didn't have to do that. I know, he said, but I want this place to be yours as much as mine. Not just in practice, in truth. She crossed to him and touched his forearm, still raw where the sun had caught it. You always do things that way quietly, but all the way through. He rested his hand over hers. I waited a long time to find someone who wanted to stay. I'm not about to hold back now. That night, the rain came soft and steady, tapping the roof with the gentleness of someone knocking only to let you know they were still there. They lay side by side, his hand resting at the small of her back, her breath warm against his collarbone. Tell me something I don't know about you, she said, voice almost lost to the sound of the storm. He was silent for a beat. Then, I almost left after the war, thought I'd ride west until the land ran out. What stopped you? He turned to face her fully. I found my mother's old ledger. She'd written down every calf born, every jar of preserves put up, even the name of the first dog we had. It reminded me that someone had cared enough to keep track, that this place meant something. Perrie reached up and traced the edge of his brow with her thumb. And now it means more than it ever did, because of you. She kissed him then, not for comfort, but for the sheer rightness of the life they were shaping. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and the slow burn of something that had taken root and would not be moved. By late summer, the first of the peach saplings arrived in burlap-wrapped bundles from a rancher out near Helena. They dug trenches together, careful not to crowd the roots, and watered each one by hand. Nate carved markers from pine slats, and Perrie painted the names in neat script: July Blaze, Alberta, Indian Free. One morning, she found him sitting on the porch, holding a folded letter in his hand. He passed it to her without a word. Inside was a note from the Dry Creek School Board. They'd found a permanent teacher for the town schoolhouse, but were looking to open a smaller classroom near Linton Hill for ranch children too far to travel daily. They're asking if I'd consider it, she said, reading. I think they'd be lucky to have you, Nate said. But only if it's what you want. She looked out toward the pasture where the cattle moved like slow clockwork across the ridge. I do want it, a few mornings a week, just enough to teach letters, numbers. Maybe stories too. Then say yes. I already have. The following weeks filled with preparations, benches built from spare lumber, a slate board hauled in by wagon, and a small pot-bellied stove set near the rear wall of the outbuilding they cleared for the school. Children from nearby homesteads came quiet at first, but warmed quickly under Perrie's gentle steadiness. Back at the ranch, life continued its slow, honest progress. Fences needed mending, calves needed watching, and the fruit trees began to show their first eager leaves. One evening in early autumn, as the light dipped gold and thick over the land, Perrie stood barefoot in the garden, fingers dusty from pulling late carrots. Nate came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. You've made this place more than I ever imagined it could be, he said into her hair. She leaned back into him. You gave it room for me to grow. They stayed like that, watching the sun dissolve behind the hills, the scent of earth and harvest in the air. When they went inside, he took her hand without a word, led her to the worn rocking chair by the hearth, and sat with her curled into his side. The fire cracked low, and the world outside hushed itself. They didn't speak, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything worth saying had already been shown in peach trees planted side by side, in ink on a deed, in the quiet joining of hands as the seasons turned. And in that silence, they built the life they'd both thought lost to time, shaping it with care day after day until it stood firm and whole beneath the Montana sky.